All right, I'm going to talk to you today about Adobe Illustrator. I'm going to start at the very beginning. And well, there might be more videos that have subsequent studies, but Adobe Illustrator is a very robust program. There's so much that you can do in it. And it will take me a long time to explain everything to you, but you have to overcome the first hurdles, the first mental hurdles. I know a lot of artists are intimidated by Adobe Illustrator, and I think the large reason why they are is because they don't really understand exactly what it is. And I think the problem with it is because Adobe Illustrator it's one of the worst named programs that are out there. When we think of Illustrator, we think of somebody who takes paint and they push it around on canvas and they smush it together and it blends and it's beautiful and it's free form and all that other stuff. And you notice when you jump into Adobe Illustrator, that is not the case. So here is the main takeaway that I want you to kind of memorize in your head, and I'll help you kind of overcome this mental hurdle. And that is that Adobe Illustrator is an object-based program. So what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is that if I was to jump into Adobe Photoshop and I was to just start kind of painting pixels around, I will bring my layers palette over here so you can see it. I can paint on a layer and then I can change my color and continue painting on that layer, and pixels are going to replace pixels and they're going to merge into pixels and they're going to smear into pixels. And you kind of move those pixels around based upon the painting that you're creating, and it all remains on one layer until you create a new layer. And those pixels change and they morph and they've got soft edges and they've got some transparency qualities and all that good stuff. When you're in Adobe Illustrator, that's not the case. Instead of painting with pixels, you paint with objects, and you create objects, you create solid objects, and then you assign attributes to those objects. So if I was to kind of give you a parallel, imagine if Photoshop's like working with oil paint on canvas, and Adobe Illustrator is like working with cut paper. So you cut your different shapes out, and then you stack those shapes onto a presentation. But at any time, you can remove those shapes, you can change the order, you can reposition them, you can rotate them, you can do whatever you want to them, and they remain the same shape. And so that's going to be one of the biggest differences. The other big difference, and I know you're familiar with this, is the difference between vector versus raster. So, and Adobe Photoshop everything is built on pixels. Adobe Illustrator is built on objects, and those objects are created as a vector outline. And so what I mean by that is that you'll notice that if you select an object, that you end up with these anchor points. And there's these little points that kind of are all around this object shape that I've created. Those anchor points are plots of points on your canvas, given coordinates, an X, Y, and coordinate as it relates to your artboard right here. And you'll notice that when I select a point, you get directional handles. And those directional handles actually define what the curve should look like, the parabolic curve, what it should look like between two anchor points. And actually, what this directional handle is doing right here and what that one is doing right there is writing a mathematical equation between these two anchor points. That's an actual mathematical equation that gives you that curve, gives you that parabolic curve. Thank goodness we don't have to write that mathematical equation, because that would be a lot of work. The computer does that for us in the background all the time. So what this allows us to do, obviously, is it allows us to have resize capabilities. And that's probably the biggest advantage of Adobe Illustrator. It also gives you a really nice clean line that's never going to be pixelated. It's never going to be jagged. It's always going to be this really nice clean line, and gives you this hard-edged object. And then once you have, and you've created this hard-edged object, you can assign attributes to that object. So what are some of those attributes? Well, obviously you have fill color. So this is my fill color. It's kind of like a light bluish color. Another attribute is the stroke attribute. So you can give yourself a stroke color. You can give yourself a stroke size. That is another attribute you can control and manipulate. You can throw a gradient in there, for instance. Or you can throw a gradient on the stroke even. So there's my gradient in the center. You can throw a pattern. You can even toggle with transparency. That is also an attribute that you can play around with. So between messing with all those different attributes, you can get some really cool effects to the objects that you create that can help you build your Adobe Illustrator creation. The other thing you can do is you can also import objects as well. Raster objects, you can combine them with vector shapes. We'll talk about that in another presentation. So I have some examples here. So this is an umbrella illustration I did. So this object, you can see just a single object, just like cut paper. It has this gradient attribute assigned to it. This one has a solid assigned to it. This one has a gradient. That one has a gradient. That one has a solid. These are gradients on the inside of the umbrella. Here's a gradient right here. So basically you can see how you can create some really cool looking dynamic illustrations just simply by first creating proper shapes. That's the biggest thing, is you have to learn how to create proper shapes. And then assigning attributes to those shapes that can give you all of your colors and values and stuff like that. To get started, I want to talk first about the palettes, and then I want to jump right into the toolbar, because once you understand the toolbar, it's going to be a lot more easy for you to get through the concepts of Adobe Illustrator. So the palettes are just like the palettes in Photoshop and Adobe InDesign, in that if there's anything that you can control or manipulate, there's probably a palette for it. The difference between the palette in Adobe Illustrator and the palettes in Photoshop, it goes back to the difference between working with objects versus working with pixels. And a couple of places where you'll see some of those biggest differences, one of them is going to be your layers palette. Now you can have layers in Adobe Illustrator like you can have layers in Photoshop. However, there's a couple of differences. Number one, you'll notice this is my layers palette, and you'll notice there's a lot of things missing from it that are there in Photoshop that are not here in Illustrator. And one of those elements obviously is your layer transparency. You don't have layer transparency in Adobe Illustrator because the transparency is done based on the objects. You can make the objects transparent, therefore there's no real need for you to make the layer transparent. Another difference you'll notice is that you have this column right here, which will lock the entire layer. In Adobe Photoshop, you have all these different lock options. You can lock position, you can lock pixels, you can lock transparency, you can lock the entire layer. The only thing you can do here is lock the entire layer, and what that does is it locks all the objects on that layer. So that's what that one is right there. You can turn the layers on or off with the eyeball like you can with Adobe Photoshop. But here is the main difference. If I click on this arrow right here, you'll notice that it expands and it gives me every single thing that is on that layer. And these are all the different objects as their individual objects, because as I create an object and then I create another object on top of it, it doesn't merge with that object like it does in Photoshop. It just is another object on top of another object. And at any time, I can go into these into this layer and I can move objects around. I can move this object to the front. You can see how I move the tail forward. I can let's move this object to the front. You see, move that forward. And you can move these objects back and forth within the layer simply by grabbing them and moving them within your layers palette. See if I've got another example. So here I've got my different layers. So on each individual, so you can have different layers like you can in Photoshop, and then you can have, but then automatically on that layer, it's going to stack those objects as individual elements. And even if you group objects, it'll show you what's in that group. You'll notice too that if you select an object, this little blue icon shows up. And when that little blue icon shows up, what you can do is you can move that blue icon then into a new layer. And when you drop into a new layer, it actually picks up that object and moves into a new layer. And obviously the layer hierarchy is going to determine what's going to be on top in regards to your object. So I just moved this object, which was on the very bottom of this layer, to layer 6, which then automatically puts it at the very top of everything. And that was done simply by first grabbing an object with my selection tool, and then I get this little, oh, I just selected the entire layer. That's another key too. If you wanted to select the entire layer, you can just double click right there. So grab that object and then make sure you click and drag without double clicking this icon here, and I can move it to any layer I want after that, and it'll automatically reposition that object. So here's another example. You have all these different layers, all these different objects. I used a lot of objects to create this layer. This is a very complicated, you'll notice this is a very complicated illustration. So obviously the more objects, or the more complicated your illustration is, obviously the more objects you'll be creating. And so when you expand these layers, the bigger that they'll get. The best practice is to keep the layers collapsed, because this is a lot of information. And for the most part, you really don't need to see this, because I can just grab my object with my object selection tool. I don't need to try to find it within this assortment down here, because that would be very cumbersome. I can just grab that object and then I can just move it to wherever I want to at that moment. So that is the big difference between your layers in Adobe Illustrator versus Adobe Photoshop. These icons are pretty much the same as they are in Photoshop. That will delete your layer, that will create a new layer. This will create a new sub-layer underneath your layer. So one of these guys. And then you can also, this deals with clipping masks, which we'll deal with at another time. The other big difference in Adobe Illustrator over Adobe Photoshop is the attributes palette. So Swatches is an attributes palette. That's the one I keep open all the time because I like to refer to it. But others include Color Guide. Brushes, do not deal with brushes right now till we talked about that later, because it's complete misnomer. It's completely different than anything that you believe a brush should be. So I don't want you to mess around with that for right now. Color, so if you have a CMYK dial in, you can plug that in right here. Symbols, that's for another day. Stroke attribute, so stroke weight. You can also do a dashed line, you can do arrowheads. So that's always cool if you're creating like informational graphics and stuff like that. I'm going to do a call out to, there we go, my dotted line. Call out to the little bird's head, little bird's noggin. And we're going to change the dash to 2 points instead of 12 points. There we go. And let's make this 2 points as well. There we go. And now we're going to add an arrowhead to the front, and then that could be my call out graphic. So I can say note the position of this bird's mohawk, or whatever it is I want to say. All right, so that's that. Transparency. Now under Adobe InDesign is called Effects, in Illustrator is called Transparency. And this is where I can make something transparent. And when I make something transparent, obviously you can see through that object now at 60%. So what Adobe Illustrator is doing is it is applying that attribute to that entire object. And whether I resize or rescale or do whatever I want to that object, it will reapply that attribute to it. So that in this case, the attribute is 60% transparency. Now you'll notice that once I do that, I can see all the other objects underneath it. If that's not something that I want to make the entire shape transparent. Let's say, for example, I'm going to select the entire shape. I'm going to give it 60% transparency. Now what it does is it just makes each one of these individual shapes transparent. If that's not what I want, if I want the entire object to be transparent, we'll undo that real quick. Then I'm going to select it, and then I'm going to go to my group, and I'm going to group it. And now when I change the opacity, it'll change the opacity on the entire shape as opposed to the individual components. When you group a bunch of objects together, we'll then read that as one object. So when this is all grouped together and I create a fill, it'll uniformly fill everything. So that's something to keep in mind. And likewise if I do a transparency. So going down, let's see if there's any others that you need to be aware of right now. Layers is the most important. Swatches probably the second most important. We'll go over characters and all that later. So I think that's a gradient. The way a gradient works is that first you assign that you want the shape to be a gradient, and then you control the gradient. So it's kind of confusing, but bear with me here. So right here, I click on this button, and that will make that a gradient. Now, if I don't want that black and white gradient just as I see it, now I can make some changes to it. So I can go to my Swatches palette, and I can drop in a color here, and I can drop in a color right here. Now let's make it a greater. There we go, we'll do that color. Now I've got my gradient, and then I can go to my gradient tool here on the toolbar, and I can change the direction of the gradient. I can change the scope of the gradient. Here back in my gradient palette, I can turn it to a radial gradient if I want. And I can manipulate my gradient that way. And the final note about swatches. So these are the best way to assign colors to your object is to first store them in your swatches and then just go back to referring to your swatches. A couple of reasons. Number one, it makes your workflow faster. Number two, it unifies your colors. If you go ahead of time, you create a color palette and you dump those colors into your swatches palette, then you can be sure that you're using unified colors. For example, this color right here, here it is in my color palette. I can drag it into my swatches palette, or I can create a new swatch this way. And I'll also create that color. You can call this Blue Bird Blue, and it will dump that into my swatch palette and give it a Bluebird Blue. Same with this one. So we're going to create a new swatch. We'll call this Light Blue. So that way, at any time, I can then just click on my swatches palette and I don't have to try to refine that color. And that's probably best practices for using your swatches palette. Oftentimes when I open up a new document, I go to create a new document, I will select all of these preloaded swatches because I already have my set color palette, and I'll delete them and then I'll start loading in my new colors. So for instance, let's see if my Lost in Space one is that way. So yeah, you can see on my Lost in Space one, I don't have any of those original colors that default when you open up the program. I'm just using the colors that I created for this particular color scheme. All right, let's now talk about our toolbar. So this is the toolbar. If you are using a CC version of Adobe Illustrator, you'll notice that the toolbar may come stacked in a single layer like this. You may also notice that your toolbar doesn't have all the tools that mine is showing right now. That's because Adobe Illustrator in the latest version of CC has decided to have different versions of toolbars based upon what kind of project you are working on, which I don't like. I'm not a fan of that. But you just need to go to Workspace, and underneath Workspace, you got all these different ideas. There's Classic Essentials. I'm using an older version. There's Classic Essentials. Select that, and you'll get my toolbar, in which you have all the tools available to you. So I want to make sure that you have that. And then I always click on this button here because I like to see the tools side by side. I like it more organized this way, but that's your preference, however you wish to do it. So on your tools, the first tools that we're going to talk about are very, very important to understand. You have your selection tool and you have your direct select tool. Those are very, very different. And the way this works is in Adobe Photoshop, you've got your move tool. It's got that little 4 arrows on it, and you select it and you can move the entire layer. Here we don't have layers. Instead we have objects. So this black arrow, it says it's called the selection tool. I'm going to call it the object selection tool because that really is what it is. When you have the black arrow select or highlighted, that means now I can select any one of these individual objects. And once I have selected that individual object with the tool, then I can move that object with the same tool. And this tool is great for just selecting objects. You also notice that when you select an object with the object select tool, you'll notice that I get a bounding box. And when I get that bounding box, I'll have 4 corners. These 4 corners allow me to make any kind of manipulations to that object, such as stretch and squash or rotate. So that is the object selection tool. Now here is the key. The one next to it is called the direct select tool. And what's very critical about the direct select tool is if you select inside of an object with the direct select tool, it will act like the object select tool. But if you just roll over an anchor point and click on that, then you can select just that anchor point. And when you select just the anchor point, then whatever manipulation that you do to that anchor point affects only that anchor point. So for instance, with my direct select tool, I can select in the center of my object and I can move the whole object, or I can click and drag over just the anchor point and just select that anchor point. And now I can move just the anchor point, and the rest of the anchor points stay in place. That's very important. This allows you to make manipulations to anchor points without affecting the entire object, and that is going to be the key to really being able to work properly in Adobe Illustrator, is your ability to make changes to anchor points without manipulating the objects. And the way the Illustrator will work is you will create an object, which is probably not going to be perfect on your first time around, on your first go around, and then you can go back and you can manipulate the object to clean it up to be exactly what it is you need it to be by manipulating those anchor points with the Direct Select tool. You cannot manipulate the anchor points with the Selection tool. You can see if I try, it's just going to grab the whole object. There's nothing I can do about it. I have to use the Direct Select tool. And if my whole object is selected, I have to reselect just that anchor point. Easiest way to do that is click and drag. You can also select multiple anchor points by holding the Shift button. So I'll click right there and hold Shift and click. And there's two ways you can select an anchor point. You can either click and drag like that, or you can roll over the anchor point if you can find it, and then click. And Illustrator will give you a clue. Once you've rolled over it, you'll see how my arrow changes. That's how I know I'm over an anchor point. Then I can just click once, it will select that. The third way where you can select multiple anchor points, just say I want just these anchor points right here. Well, if I try to click and drag like that, I'm going to be selecting these ones as well. I don't want to select those ones. So you have your lasso select tool, and your lasso select tool will allow you to just lasso over the anchor points you wish to select. And then I go back to my Direct Select tool, make sure I do that, and then I can move those anchor points. And then Magic Wand Selection tool, what that will do is it will select everything that has the same attributes, every object that has the same attributes. So in this case, I clicked on this blue right here, and this is also filled with that blue, so it's selected both of them. If I click on this right here, all three of those will be selected. So let's just say I'm working and I don't know, let's just say I need to make a change to this color. Everywhere where that color shows up in my illustration, I will click outside of here, so we deselect everything. I click once on just that shape and where it's happening one time. And then let's just say I can change it to whatever color I want. Now this is a very simple illustration, but you'll see that this Magic Wand tool, if you have an extremely complex illustration, comes very much in handy, and it's a very useful tool. Now I want to talk about the infamous pen tool. And that's the one tool that everyone's like, pen tool. I hate the pen tool. And I don't blame them. And the reason why people hate the pen tool is because, again, it's poorly named. The pen tool is not a pen. That's the first thing you have to remember. Get in your head. Take the idea of a pen out of your mind and throw it away. And when you do that, you'll be able to use a pen tool better. The pen tool is actually a plotting device. So if you think of this not as a pen tool, because you think of pen, you think, calligraphy and thick and thin and ink's going everywhere. That's not the case here. And you'll notice that if you try to draw with the pen tool, it's weird. It's just not doing it. And the reason is because it's not a pen. It is a plotting tool. And what the pen tool does is it drops anchor points and allows you to manipulate directional handles in order to manipulate the curve that goes in between the anchor points. So here are some key points you need to know about the pen tool. Number one, like I said, it is not, get the whole idea of a pen out of your mind. It is a plotting tool. Number two, the way it works is you plot 2 points and then you try to anticipate the curve between the 2 points. So you plot a point, and the way that you do it with your mouse is click and drag. Remember that in your mind. Click and drag, click and drag, click and drag, click and drag. Ingrain that into your subconscious, because that's how you use a pen tool. Click and drag, not click, click, click. Click and drag. That's the only way you can get the curves. So click and drag, I get directional handles. These directional handles don't tell me where my next point should be. these directional handles tell me what my curve is going to look like. That is the other mental hurdle you're going to have to get over. I can set my directional handle here, even though I want my next point to be right here. The two attributes that the directional handles control, they control the direction out of the anchor point that the path is going to go, and they also control the strength out of that anchor point that the path is going to go. So if it's a short directional handle, it's going to come out of that anchor point slowly or with little strength. If it's a long one, it's going to come out of that anchor point with a lot of strength. I'm going to plot my next point over here so you can see what that looks like. And so you can see this is where my directional handle is, but this is where I wanted my next point to be. If you imagine your directional handles are kind of like your hands, and my path is like a piece of flexible steel. If I want my piece of flexible steel to be a straight piece, I turn my hands like this. In other words, my directional handles I would have facing each other like that. But if I wanted my flexible steel to be bent, I turn my hands like this. Now, the steel starts in this hand and it ends in this hand, but my hands are pointed up. So with my anchor points, my anchor points are still right here and right here, but I have my directional handles pointed up in order to bend that steel. And that's the way you have to think about that path, is in order to bend the path, you have to turn the directional handles 90 degrees from the direction that you want that path to go. You really have to block this thought out of your head. Do not put your directional handle where you want your point. You want to put your directional handle where you anticipate how you want your point to go. And here's the other challenge, is that you have to use both directional handles to define that curve. So not only are you having to think about what this directional handle is doing, you also have to think about what that one is going to do at the same time on the back end of the curve. But it gets even harder than that, because you'll notice that I've got two ends to this directional handle. One is defining this curve. The other is going to be defining the next movement of the curve. And so I'm having to think about where my directional handle is going to be in regards to this, as well as where is this going to be in regards to that. And so that is a lot to think about, a lot to overcome. And even when you come to the end, you want to click and drag. Don't just click and drag. That way you can get that full directional handle. And then I can go back, I can move anchor points, and I can actually go to my directional handles and I can toggle them in order to get the shape that I wish to get. So that is the biggest key. So the recommendation is to plot your anchor points on either end of the curve. So if this is my curve right here, I'll plot my anchor point here, here, and there. You want to plot your anchor points where the curve is, right where the curve is about to happen. So if you've got a complicated image like this, so if you go back to my bluebird, look at where I've plotted my anchor points. So I have this curve right here. I plot my anchor points on either side of the curve, not on the center, on the top of the curve. I want to create that curve with as little anchor points as possible, and I can do that if I plot my anchor points on the beginning and the end of the curve, and I don't worry about trying to plot it in the center of the curve. So that is something to keep in mind. The other thing to keep in mind too is that oftentimes I will work on a sketch either on top or underneath. And that way, when I create my paths, my sketch is my guideline. And when I have a sketch underneath, it's a lot easier to kind of anticipate what those curves should be and kind of work around, as opposed to just trying to do it in dead space. And I recommend getting started to always bring a sketch in first and create your paths around a sketch, as opposed to just trying to freehand it, because it's going to be very, very difficult. With the introduction of the pen tool and the anchor point, I need to make sure I clarify a few things. What I've been talking about up to this point is a smooth anchor point. And a smooth anchor point is defined by any anchor point in which a path enters the anchor point and then exits out the other side smoothly without any bend or kink to it. So you'll notice that when I have a smooth anchor point, that my directional handles, they work independently of each other. I cannot move this directional handle here without affecting that one there. Now I can change the sizes of the directional handles. I can have different sizes, but as far as their alignment, they're aligned in a perfect straight perpendicular to each other, or a perfect straight, I guess, linear line to each other. And you'll notice that as I move one up, the other goes down and such like, and so forth. And that is so that that path maintains that consistent smoothness in and out of that anchor point. But that's not the only type of anchor point you have. Another type of anchor point is called the corner anchor point. And the corner anchor point, and I'm going to bring up the corner anchor point tool right here, is when the anchor points are broken. So I use my corner anchor point tool to grab that anchor point and to break it. And I'm going to go back to my direct select tool. And now you'll see that my anchor points work independently of each other, and this path, as it enters into this anchor point, immediately changes direction and goes a different way once it exits out on the other end. It's a corner as opposed to a smooth line. And there's reasons why you would want to employ either one of them. A good Adobe Illustrator drawing is one that has a combination of smooth and corner anchor points where appropriate. So for example, going back to my Bluebird, this right here, I'll grab it, the right one. Yep. This right here is a corner anchor point because the line comes in here and then changes direction. So it requires it to change direction. And then this right here is a smooth anchor point because the line comes in and it doesn't break, it doesn't change directions. So as you're working, here is a really good point to remember. Is sometimes as you're working, I need to change directions on the fly. I don't want to have to create my shape and have to come back and change it later on. So as you're working, one thing you can do is hold down the Option key or the Alt key if you're on a PC, and that automatically gives you the Convert Anchor Point tool. And when you get the Convert Anchor Point tool, then you can break that anchor point, change directions, and then go a different way. Another key too is while you're working, if you hold down the Command key, it will grab the last selection tool that you had. In this case, it was my Direct Select tool. And so because that was my last selection tool, I can then manipulate on the fly. I'm holding down the Command key. It would be the Control key if you're on the PC. And I can make adjustments. Let's just say this line right here is way too long, so I'll change it. Make adjustments, keep working. And then I'm going to hold down the Option key, turn that to Convert Anchor Point, change directions, and then I can keep moving. Hold down Command, move the anchor point, move this one. So the ability to make these changes while you're working is going to be very, very crucial for you. I think that is where a lot of the frustration comes, is a lot of beginners don't understand that you can make these changes while you're working. If you're trying to remember how to make all those changes once you get to the end, you have a big mess, number one, and number two, you're not going to remember everything that you wanted to do by the time you get to the end. So being able to make the change on the fly is very, very important. And that is done by toggling between the Command key and the Option key, or the Control key and the Alt key if you're on a PC. And I like to say that Adobe Illustrator is a two-fisted affair. So one hand is going to be on the mouse, one hand is going to be on the keyboard at all time doing these keyboard shortcuts. So that's a good word of advice. As you're working, you may notice that you might want to add anchor points to a path that already exists, or you might want to take some away. So this is your Add Anchor Point tool or your Delete Anchor Point tool. However, There's really no reason why you ever need to select these tools, ever. Because in Adobe Illustrator, if I select an object, like this one right here, and I just go to my regular pen tool, anytime I roll over any section of the path, I can add an anchor point. And anytime I roll over any anchor point, I can delete it. Now, one thing you might notice is that when I add an anchor point, nothing happens with the shape that I've created. When I delete an anchor point, the shape changes dramatically. Adobe Illustrator will not remember what that shape originally was before you add an anchor point. Keep that in mind. So if you add an anchor point, it rewrites these equations. So right now, before, when this and that was, these are the only two anchor points that are writing this line right here, you have one parabolic equation that's occurring. I add an anchor point, and now I have two parabolic equations, one on this side, one on that side. If I delete this anchor point, notice what happens to these directional handles. They don't change. It cannot rewrite that equation back to what it was once before. It doesn't remember it. All it remembers is what these directional handles are doing. And those directional handles, if you'll notice what they look like before I add an anchor point, what do they look like after I add that anchor point, and now what do they look like when I delete that anchor point? Those directional handles are different from when we started, and because it is different, it's going to give it a new definition to that shape. So you have to keep that in mind. If you're going to be deleting anchor points, it will affect the shape. But again, you can always go back to your direct select tool. You can try to recreate what that shape looked like by moving your directional handles. So that's what all these are underneath your pen tool. So the 4 or the 5 best tools for you to remember right off the bat are your selection tools and then your pen tools. And I hope I've given you an adequate demonstration on how to use those. The best word of advice I can give you is just practice. Adobe Illustrator does not come easy, but until you learn it. And then once you learn it, it's like riding a bicycle. It's then very, very easy. It's just hop on it and just boom, do your thing. I can hop on it and boom, do my thing because I've been practicing Adobe Illustrator since 1995. Very long time, since Illustrator was in its infancy. So I'm very used to the pen tool, but it's going to take a while. There are other tools out there like the curve tool or the shape creators tool and stuff like that that can create paths like that where you don't have to use a pen tool. But the problem is they're not going to create clean paths for you. So the cleanest paths are best created with the pen tool. Here's another piece of advice I want to give. The fewer anchor points, the cleaner your object will be. So if you can create a shape with 2 anchor points as opposed to creating that shape with several, this shape right here is a lot cleaner than this shape right here. So really, when you want to create dynamic shapes in Illustrator, it's a combination of corner anchor points versus smooth anchor points, and limiting how many anchor points you need in order to get that shape. But there's one final type of anchor point I haven't talked about, and that is a corner anchor point without directional handles. And this is what happens when, instead of clicking and dragging like I've been telling you to do, you just click, 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 click. And the result of that is you end up getting straight lines. There is no curve. There are no bends to the lines that you create. Now, there may be a time when you use it. And this corner anchor point without directional handles does not have to necessarily be inside of a rectilinear shape. If at any time you're creating a shape in Illustrator and you forget to click and drag, it will automatically create that anchor point without directional handles. What ends up happening is you end up with paths that have directional handles only on one side and not the other. And when that happens, that means you only have one side where you can dictate what the movement of that path will end up being. I find sometimes it's more dynamic if I create a straight line, still with using directional handles. And the reason why this is the case is that, number one, later on, if I need to make modifications, I have those directional handles. But number two, it just creates a slight little bend to that path, which just gives it just a little bit more of a dynamic feel to it. That wraps up this segment of Illustrator Basics.